My name is Aiden Ellis. I'm not one for big ambitions, you know. My work, simple and honest, is tending the gardens. I find peace in the earth, in the flowers I see bloom, in the routine of each season. But last spring, my life took an unexpected turn. A turn that began the day my grandmother Nora passed away and left us a will. She was a special woman, the kind you miss even before they're gone. Nora always said that the important thing in life was to cultivate, and not just plants. Cultivate respect, Aiden, kindness, truth. She said it with a sweetness that seemed to take root in your heart, and I listened. But I could never have imagined that the day we opened her would bring to light so much greed, so much coldness, so much of what she despised. In the lawyer's stuffy office, the atmosphere was tense from the start. There was a certain coldness in their eyes, a disguise of mourning, but what really hung in the air was everyone's anxiety to know what was at stake, what Nora would leave behind. I, on the other hand, felt out of place in that room, with everyone looking at me as if I were insignificant, and maybe, in their eyes, I really was. My uncle Malcolm, my mother's older brother, was the kind of man Nora never approved of. Ambitious, arrogant, and always on the hunt for the next investment. Beside him, Lydia, his wife, who seemed to mirror her husband in every detail. They both looked at each other with a gleam of expectation. It was almost palpable, the disdain they had for me, as if my presence there was an affront to the status they so cherished. My mother, who was between them, remained silent, absorbed in her grief. She had always been the devoted daughter, but she was never good at asserting herself. And in that room, her presence seemed more like a formality than anything else. The lawyer began reading, and at first, everything was quite predictable. Some assets were divided, small treasures and mementos for acquaintances and distant relatives, things with sentimental value. But then he paused, looked around, and said, "Now, about the garden on the property." That's when everything changed. Malcolm's expression shifted subtly, but clearly. He stared intently at the lawyer, trying to decipher what was coming next. Then he announced, the garden would be under my care. For all intents and purposes, the garden would be mine, a place that Nora entrusted me to cultivate and preserve. There, I felt a weight, a responsibility, but also an honor. However, as I tried to process what this meant, the looks around me immediately turned from curiosity to disdain and hostility. Malcolm didn't hide his discomfort. The garden? Seriously, this kid is going to inherit the garden. He laughed a cold, disbelieving laugh. To him, Nora's garden was a valuable space where, someday, he wanted to build something bigger. Imagine the possibilities, he used to say. But to me, the garden wasn't a piece of land. It was the heart of our family, a place that Nora cherished as a sanctuary, full of flowers that she had planted herself some decades ago. I didn't see it as something to be developed. It was something to be preserved. Lydia, with her dry, sharp voice, whispered something to Malcolm that I couldn't hear completely, but I could tell the venomous tone of each word. She seemed to mock Nora's decision, suggesting that perhaps my grandmother was disoriented when she made the will, perhaps even manipulated by the idea that someone as simple as I could take care of her legacy. I swallowed hard, but kept my composure, feeling a mix of sadness and anger. There, in that moment, I realized that greed and resentment could grow among family members in the same way that weeds grow in a once fertile field. That reading, which I thought would be quick, dragged on into arguments and insinuations. Malcolm raised issues, implying that Nora's decision couldn't be taken seriously. A gardener, that's all he is. Nora would never give something so valuable to someone without vision, without ambition. The word came out of his mouth as if he had spat a curse. I remained silent, but what they didn't know is that, even though I was just a gardener in their eyes, I had something that none of them would ever understand, a true purpose. That night, when I got home, I thought about everything that had happened. I knew the days ahead wouldn't be easy, as Malcolm, Lydia, and the others probably wouldn't rest until they found a way to get what they wanted. I felt that this garden, this sacred piece of land, meant much more to Nora than I understood at that moment. Her decision to leave me the garden now seemed like a riddle, a message that I needed to decipher. Remembering Nora, I began to reflect on the conversations we had had over the years. She always said that the garden was where she found peace, and that each plant had a secret, a story that sustained it. The flowers speak to us, Aiden. They show us what words can't say. I remembered those words and how, in the last months of her life, she began to give me little pieces of advice, fragments of stories about things that weren't what they seemed. Looking at the ceiling that night, it occurred to me that the garden might be more than a common inheritance. Perhaps there was something there that Nora wanted me to discover, something she knew that only I, someone who loved her and respected her memories, could understand and preserve. That night was the first time I truly felt in a position of confrontation with my own family. As much as I didn't want to accept it, I knew that from then on I would be seen as an obstacle, someone who had something they wanted. They never respected me. I was a simple gardener, the one who hadn't pursued an ambitious career. But ironically, it was because of this same simplicity that Nora had entrusted the garden to me, because she knew I would preserve its true value. And there, lying in the darkness of my room, I realized that my journey to honor my grandmother's legacy was just beginning. What I didn't know was that, in the midst of this conflict, there would be much more than roses to take care of. The next morning, I returned to the garden. As much as I knew the problems that awaited me, being there brought me peace. The flowers seemed to greet me, as if they knew what had happened. I ran my hands over the petals of the roses, feeling the freshness that my grandmother so appreciated. But as I tended to the plants, a detail caught my attention, a loose brick in the wall that surrounded the garden. It was partially hidden by the foliage and seemed strange to me, because in all the years I had worked there, I had never noticed anything like it. Curious, I knelt down and touched the brick, testing its stability. It yielded slightly, as if it had been placed there intentionally. I hesitated for a moment, but with a little effort, I managed to dislodge it. Behind it, there was a narrow opening, and inside it, folded carefully, was an aged letter. The envelope was yellowed with fragile edges, as if it had been there for a long time. My heart started to beat faster. I took the letter and looked around, as if expecting to find someone hidden, watching. There was no one, just the silence of the garden and the gentle breeze that rustled the leaves. I moved away a little and, with trembling hands, opened the letter. I immediately recognized my grandmother's handwriting. The words seemed familiar and mysterious at the same time. Dear Aiden, if you are reading this letter, it means the time has come. There are truths in our family that many ignore or prefer to bury. The one who finds a garden will be the guardian not only of our land, but also of our history. Some lies must be uncovered. I trust you to know what to do. As I read those lines, I felt a mixture of fear and responsibility. It was as if my grandmother knew something was about to happen and was preparing me to face the secrets hidden beneath the earth she loved so much. The garden, it seemed, was more than a sanctuary of peace. There was something there that Nora wanted to protect, something she knew only someone she trusted could discover. Over the next few days, Malcolm and Lydia's visits became frequent. They invented excuses to show up, as if they were just checking on the state of the property. But it was evident that they were trying to monitor what I was doing there. One afternoon, Lydia approached me as I was weeding. She seemed casual, but her expression was one of calculated curiosity. "So, Aiden, what do you think of your grandmother's big gift?" she asked with a cold smile. I looked at her, trying to hide my discomfort. Nora always knew what she was doing. This garden means a lot to me, and I'm going to take care of it the way she would have wanted. She raised an eyebrow, visibly annoyed by my response. I understand, but wouldn't it be better if someone with resources took care of this? Someone who could turn this area into something more profitable, perhaps? She suggested, with a look full of intent. With all due respect, Lydia, not everything in life needs to be profitable. For my grandmother, this place had a value that no amount of money could buy. I replied firmly. She remained silent for a few moments and then walked away. But I knew the fight was just beginning. Malcolm was also paying attention. On one of his visits to the garden, he began to talk about his rights as a family member and even threatened to seek a lawyer to challenge the will. It was as if my presence there was a direct affront to him and to what he believed he deserved. I was determined not to give in. That letter I found gave me a new perspective. The garden wasn't just a material asset. It was as if it were a chest of secrets that Nora, somehow, had entrusted me to unravel. I began to observe every detail, every corner, trying to discover what else she might have hidden there. One cold morning, while I was kneeling tending to some flowers, I felt the ground harder than usual at a certain point. With a shovel, I began to dig gently, not knowing what I might find. And then, something glinted beneath the earth. A small wooden box, sealed and wrapped in old cloth. My breath stopped for a moment. I carefully picked up the box and, with trembling fingers, untied the knot of the cloth. Inside it, there was a collection of yellowed documents and a small diary with a worn cover. I turned the pages carefully, realizing that they were Nora's personal notes. She mentioned several family events, but one passage in particular caught my attention. She spoke of a great betrayal that almost broke up our family, a plot to steal something precious from her. I was stunned. Her words suggested that someone close, perhaps even Malcolm, had tried to take everything from her. That discovery brought a new layer of complexity to everything I already knew. There was something very wrong, a dark history that my grandmother wanted to bury to protect our family. She talked about how the garden would keep everything until the right time, as if she knew I would find those documents and understand what to do. And as I read her words, a feeling of determination grew inside me. I needed to know more. After that discovery, my life turned into a silent battle. The documents in Nora's diary revealed more than I could have imagined. They told stories of blackmail, financial manipulation, and betrayals that went back to the early years of our family. Nora described Malcolm as an ambitious man who would do anything to get his hands on the family inheritance. He would sacrifice any principle for the promise of power, she wrote on a page that now seemed almost prophetic to me. The following days were pure tension. Malcolm, perhaps realizing my new stance, intensified his visits, and the insinuations he made to question my right to the garden began to be clearer threats. He even mentioned that he would seek a lawyer to challenge the will, claiming that Nora, in her later years, was no longer in control of her mental faculties when she wrote that document. According to him, I, a simple gardener, had no right to preserve something so important and valuable. One morning, he appeared in the garden with an even more serious expression, flanked by Lydia, who carried a folder with a stack of papers that she made a point of holding in a very visible way. "Aiden, I think it's time we settled this like adults," Malcolm began in a cold tone. I looked up, my hands still dirty with soil. "What do you mean by that, Malcolm?" He sighed, feigning a conciliatory tone. "It's simple. Lydia and I believe there's a mistake. Nora, well, you know how she was, and we know you were always very close to her. But the truth is, it doesn't make sense for you of all of us to get the garden. This place has value, Aiden, a value that you may not even understand." Lydia then intervened, giving a sarcastic giggle. "What Malcolm means is that we think it would be fairer to sell the property and divide the profits among the family. After all, Nora would want everyone to benefit and not just you." I looked at the two of them, trying to stay calm. Nora made it clear that she wanted the garden to be preserved, Lydia. And if she chose me, it's because she trusted me to do that. Malcolm pursed his lips, clearly irritated. "So that's how it's going to be? Do you think you can just ignore the wishes of the whole family? We're going to contest the will, Aiden. I have friends in the legal system, lawyers who will show that this decision was absurd." Despite the fear growing inside me, I knew that giving in now would be a betrayal of Nora's trust. I took a deep breath and faced Malcolm. Do whatever you think is best. But know that I'm not going to give up. I'm going to honor what Nora wanted, even if I have to fight for it. Lydia and Malcolm looked at each other, not knowing what to say. Then they left the garden. But I knew that was far from the end. That same afternoon, I went into town to consult a lawyer, a family friend whom Nora had always respected. He gave me some advice on how to protect myself in case Malcolm tried to challenge the will in court. On the way back, my mind was racing with thoughts. I knew I would face a long and difficult battle, but I felt deep down that I needed to continue. With each page of the diary I read, a new layer of the story unfolded. My grandmother had left clear clues that something important was hidden there, and maybe, just maybe, I was about to discover it. In the following weeks, the atmosphere at home became unbearable. Malcolm and Lydia continued to pressure me, sending formal letters and even publicly threatening that I was stealing the family's assets. But despite the weight of this psychological warfare, the garden became my refuge and my fortress. Each flower, each bush, seemed to tell a story, as if the whole place was filled with Nora's presence, whispering secrets that only I could understand. It was then one night that I received a text message that made me freeze. It was from Olivia, my sister. She was one of the few people who supported me in this conflict, although she remained more neutral to avoid friction with others. But her message was direct and frightening. Be careful. I heard Malcolm and Lydia talking about taking care of you. They're willing to do anything. I read those words with my heart racing. I didn't know if she was exaggerating, but something in her tone made me believe it. And that's how I realized that my situation was even more complicated than I imagined. I wasn't just fighting for the garden. I was fighting against people who would do anything to get what they wanted. Nora's letter and diary seemed to become more and more relevant. Her words echoed in my mind, and I knew there was more to discover. In the following pages of the diary, Nora mentioned a hidden secret that she said was buried in the garden. I started to search every patch of land, every corner, looking for a clue. Then, one rainy afternoon, while I was at the back of the garden, I tripped over something hard in the ground. I knelt down and started digging with my hands, removing the soil little by little, until I found a small metal box locked with an old padlock. My fingers trembled as I held the box. I went back inside and, with a wire, managed to open the rusty padlock. Inside, I found more documents, some with old stamps and others on newer paper. They were account records, purchase and sale contracts, and, strangest of all, a letter from Nora addressed to Malcolm. She confronted him directly about a money laundering scheme. According to the letter, Malcolm had tried to convince Nora to sell part of the property so he could invest in a risky project. He tried to manipulate his grandmother, but upon discovering the truth, Nora confronted him, threatening to cut ties with him if he continued with his greed. My eyes scanned the lines of the letter, absorbing every detail, as I felt a mixture of anger and relief. Now, finally, I had something concrete to use against Malcolm. He wasn't just trying to take the garden. He had cheated Nora years ago and was continuing with his plans. I knew this discovery would change everything, but I also knew I was increasingly exposed to the danger Malcolm represented. I closed the box and put the documents away, determined to use them at the right time. That week, Olivia decided to organize a family meeting, claiming that everyone needed to settle things once and for all. In truth, she knew that the tension between us was only increasing, and the situation was unsustainable. Deep down, I believe she hoped the meeting would be a chance to bring some respite, maybe even reconciliation. I knew this was a distant dream, but I agreed to go. After all, it would be my opportunity to confront Malcolm and Lydia in front of everyone and reveal what I had discovered. On the appointed day, the hall was filled with familiar faces. I felt the suspicious looks of some, the disdain of others. To many, I was just a family gardener, and they believed that I was there somehow usurping what should be Malcolm's. He, of course, made a point of fueling this view, always painting the story in a way that made him look like the victim. When Malcolm arrived, accompanied by Lydia, I noticed a calculated smile on his face. He approached me, disguising the sarcasm with an almost friendly tone. Aiden, I'm glad you came. Maybe, finally, we can resolve this misunderstanding. His voice was low, but there was a threatening tone behind the words. I remained calm, but I was anxious. I had brought the metal box with me, hidden in a folder, and I knew I was ready to use the evidence contained therein. I sat next to Olivia, who gave me a look of support. We knew that this could turn into a battle, and in a way, that's what I expected. When everyone was present, Malcolm stood up as if he were a leader and began to speak. He presented a version of the story that painted me as an opportunist, someone who had manipulated Nora in her final years to secure the garden. He said I was trying to control the family's assets, which was unfair and illegal. I have proof that my mother was not of sound mind when she made the will. She always valued our family unity, and this absurd division that Aiden is promoting goes against everything she preached. Malcolm looked at the others, trying to win allies. I listened, watching every word. He was skilled with words, and many seemed to believe what he said. Lydia, at his side, nodded in agreement, agreeing with every accusation. When he finally finished his speech, I stood up. I felt all eyes turned to me, some in anticipation, others in disdain. I took a deep breath and started to speak, keeping my tone firm. I heard everything Malcolm said, and now I want everyone to hear the other side. Maybe it's time for you to know the truth about who the unjust heir he claims to be really is. My voice was calm, but full of determination. Calmly, I opened the folder and took out the letter I found in the garden, the one Nora had written to Malcolm. I began to read aloud, revealing the details about the financial scheme he had tried to implement years ago when he had manipulated Nora to try to sell the property. With every word I read, I felt the tension grow in the room. Expressions of shock and distrust appeared on the faces around me. Some seemed incredulous, others concerned. This letter proves that Malcolm tried to cheat Nora, our grandmother, for financial gain. And he didn't stop there. He's trying to do it again, making up lies about the will and about me, just to get his hands on what's not his. Malcolm, who had been trying to maintain a controlled demeanor, could no longer hide his anger. He stood up abruptly, pointing a finger at me. This is absurd. This letter is a forgery, an invention. You, Aiden, a simple gardener, really think you can come here and fool us with this theater? I felt the adrenaline rush through my body, but I remained calm. I'm not a forger, Malcolm, and there are other documents here. Proof of the transactions and the attempted manipulation that you tried to cover up. You think you can keep lying, but I'm going to fight to make sure everyone knows the truth about who you really are. Malcolm seemed cornered, but Lydia, always the accomplice, tried to intervene. This is all a farce. This gardener just wants to take advantage of our family's kindness. Her voice was full of disdain. But at that moment, Olivia stood up and took the floor. I saw the truth with my own eyes, and I believe Aiden. Malcolm, you've spent your life trying to deceive people, and now it's time to face the consequences. He is proof, and we can all see that you're desperate. Olivia's statement seemed to weaken Malcolm even further, and a murmur began to run through the hall. Some people were questioning his character, and I knew that Malcolm's mask was about to fall off completely. It was then that a new sound interrupted the discussion, the sound of sirens outside. Everyone turned, surprised. Someone had called the police, and I knew it wasn't anyone on my side. As soon as the police entered, Malcolm and Lydia turned pale. One of the officers approached me and asked to see the documents I had. As I handed them over, Malcolm tried to argue, but the officer interrupted him, saying he had been notified of possible fraud surrounding the inheritance. Malcolm tried to defend himself, but every excuse he invented seemed to weaken him even further. The officers began to investigate the documents right there, and the pressure of the truth became unbearable for him. In the end, as the police collected evidence and asked Malcolm and Lydia to accompany them to give a statement, a heavy silence fell over the room. The other family members watched the scene in shock, unable to say anything. I knew that night would be remembered as the moment when Malcolm's true character was exposed to everyone. When he was finally taken away, I took one last look at Olivia, who returned with a discreet nod of relief and support. I felt the weight of the struggles of the past few days dissolve a little. I had honored Nora's memory, defended what was right, and preserved my grandmother's garden. After that night, an almost unreal silence settled over my life. It was as if the house and the garden were breathing again, free from the weight of Malcolm and Lydia's threats. The family, who had previously been shrouded in doubts and suspicions, now finally understood the truth. I felt immense relief, as if the roots of my grandmother Nora's garden were stronger than ever, rooted in the soil of justice. As the days went by, I began to devote more and more time to the garden, caring for it with renewed affection. Every flower, every plant seemed to remind me of my grandmother's strength and the purpose she had left me as a legacy. Working there was no longer just a job, but a way to keep Nora's memory alive of every piece of advice she had given me, every value she had tried to teach me. One morning, as I was pruning some rose bushes, Olivia appeared. She had been visiting me frequently now, and our relationship seemed to have strengthened in the face of events. She watched me in silence for a few minutes before approaching. "You really transformed this place, Aiden," she said, with a gentle smile on her face. "Nora would be proud of you. You kept what she valued most." I smiled, feeling a warmth in my chest that only that place could give me. All I did was follow what she taught me, Olivia. Maintaining the garden, caring for the plants, it's like I'm taking care of a part of her that still lives here. Olivia nodded, and together we walked through the garden, amidst the scent of the flowers Nora had planted. The beauty of that space was indescribable, but what mattered most was the meaning it carried. For a moment, I thought about everything that had happened, the lies, the betrayals, the greed. But I also remembered something essential that Nora always said. The most valuable things can't be bought, Aiden. They need to be cultivated. That afternoon, as the sun set and bathed the garden in a golden light, I felt a deep peace. I knew that the worst was over, and that now the garden was finally safe, away from the hands of those who wanted to turn it into something Nora would never approve of. The months passed, and my routine in the garden became almost sacred. Every plant I touched, every new flower that bloomed, all of it seemed part of a larger cycle, a living reminder of the wonderful person Nora was. I always believed that she, in some way, was there with me, watching every gesture, every care. And what about Malcolm and Lydia? Well, they faced the consequences of their actions. With the evidence I found, justice determined that the attempts to challenge the will and manipulate the inheritance were fraudulent. Malcolm had to answer for it, and his reputation, which he valued so much, was destroyed. Lydia distanced herself from the family, and I learned that both of them had to deal with financial difficulties since then. Maybe it was fate, maybe it was just the result of their own choices. Either way, the garden was safe from their ambitions. At the end of this turbulent cycle, I realized that I had learned more than I ever imagined. The garden became for me not just a place of work, but a true refuge, a symbol of everything Nora represented. Every time I put my hands in the soil, I felt like I was giving back to my grandmother all the love and teaching she had given me. One afternoon, as I was taking care of a new flower bed, I found something else. Under a layer of soil, right near the rose bushes, there was a small, yellowed envelope. When I opened it, I found a short note, but it seemed to have been written for me. Nora's handwriting was slightly faded, but still legible. "Aiden, you are the seed I planted with the most love. I know you will flourish and care for this place like no one else. I trust you to keep alive what truly matters. With love, Nora." Tears streamed down my face, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. It was a mixture of longing and gratitude, a relief for having honored everything she had taught me. I knew that from then on, my mission was not just to maintain the garden, but also to preserve the values and love that Nora had cultivated. Today, the garden is a living place, full of stories and memories, where every plant carries a part of my grandmother's legacy. Sometimes, people pass by and are enchanted by the beauty of the place, without knowing how much it means, how much it was preserved with effort, tears, and resilience. I, on the other hand, don't need anyone else to understand its value. Here, amidst the flowers, I found my peace. And I know that wherever Nora is, she smiles, proud to know that her garden, her refuge, and her moral legacy continue to live on, just as she dreamed.
Hi, you are on the Moving Narratives channel. Subscribe and follow our stories.